How are you, sir? Good to see you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. As always, thank you for your very warm and gracious welcome. It's a great pleasure to join you, and just to reiterate the gratitude that I have to be with three of the strongest advocates for a liberated Iran, the ambassador, the senator, and the general. It's a pleasure to be in their company as well. I watched that video for the second or third or fourth time. I don't know. Unfortunately, there are probably 7 videos because the innocent, defenseless residents of both Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty have undergone 7 attacks, 140 people dead, hundreds injured. And I guess you have to ask yourself, we have basically surrounded these men and women going on for 10 years. We have limited their ingress and egress from Ashraf to Liberty. They can't come and go necessarily when they please. They were disarmed by the American forces in 2004. They were promised better living conditions when they moved from Ashraf to Liberty, and the United Nations, I'll just flat say, lied to the residents. There's no other way to say it. They showed photographs of what had been, but it had been dismantled by the Iraqis years before. And you say to yourself, we've got these fearless but defenseless men and women surrounded by forces that, frankly, their very presence threaten their existence every day because it is about fear and intimidation. They have limited ability to come and go. Their movement is restricted. And you say to yourself, what's the rationale? What's the justification? What is the purpose on 7 different occasions to literally lead a military assault on people that are trapped in a small arena, a small area? I want you to hold that thought for a moment because the explanation is quite clear and understandable for those who are willing to take the time to look beyond this nonsense that the Iranian regime is moderate, to look beyond. I mean, that is absolutely delusional. But hold that thought, and you ask yourself, why? Now, we all know that the Middle East has been a cauldron of unrest for decades, if not centuries. It's always been that way. Tribe against tribe, now nation state against nation states, Sunni versus Shia. So it's been a very turbulent piece of geography for a long, long time. And the latest manifestation of what has transpired over there, and it has grown, is we've seen the attacks in San Bernardino, which I would say to you is an outgrowth of decades of that cauldron. But some country, in my judgment, has been primarily responsible for stirring the pot. And so while we're talking about the horror and the tragedy of 2015 and 2014, the Hebdo murders, the Paris murders, the incident in Ottawa, San Bernardino, I want you to go back 35 years to 1979 and think about it for a moment. Now, admittedly, the Shah of Iran was not a Democrat as we know it. He was an ally, but he was not a Democrat. And as a result of that relationship with us, and I think there has been historically great respect for the culture of Iran and its contributions to civilization literally for hundreds of years, the Ayatollah and his radicals took over our embassy. I think we all remember that. Some of you, I presume most of you were born before 1979, but a guy like me goes back to 1979, and I remember exactly where I was. So we have the radicals led by the Ayatollah, Khomeini, takes the embassy hostage, I think 444 days, if I recall correctly. And I would suggest to you that may have been the beginning. At least it was a seminal moment in the development of the radical Islam that we see across the globe today. And you say to yourself, well, how do you explain that? I mean, what's the etiology? You can't just trace it to 1979. Well, I won't. I'll take you to 1983 in a barracks in Lebanon. 241 Marines at the hands of the Iranian government. Well, you say, well, that's all right. That happens over there from time to time, blah, blah, blah. You kind of try to justify it. You can't, in my mind, ever justify it. What else do you want to talk about? Well, how about several years later, the Ayatollah issues a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, saying it's perfectly all right. He's an infidel. He's blaspheming our religion. Murder, execution is permitted. We've interpreted the Quran that way. It's your duty. So the radicals take over. They move outside that web of intrigue into Lebanon. They suddenly send that first decree embracing the murder of an individual. It was a cultural war, freedom of press. It was about censorship. So I think if you are looking for a seminal moment, you can probably trace to those three incidents, those three periods, but I'll take even further. Senator Lieben mentioned that the capital of the terrorism is Tehran, but they also are the central bank for terrorism, and unfortunately, we're going to make a huge deposit, maybe about $100 billion. And think about this for a moment. It is no secret. It's some of that money, logistic support, troops, financial support, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic Jihad. So from that moment in 1979 through today, if you're looking for that nation, that group that have stirred that cauldron of unrest, and now it's turned into this medieval barbarism as manifested in ISIS, I think you go back to 1979, the first Ayatollah in the storming of our embassy. And what have they wrought? They have wrought not only the unrest in that region, but they have wrought the global scourge. And I believe we are kidding ourselves in this country if we don't go back to 1979 and understand that the seeds of Islamic radicalism was sown right there. And 35 years later, those seeds have resulted not just in terrorism in that region, but these fundamentalists, this Islamic terrorism, the fundamentalists, these radical Islamicists throughout the globe. And make no mistake about it, they're not just limited to the Middle East and North Africa. They've spread into South America. They're just about every continent on the face of the earth. You know, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about the Iranian nuclear deal. I just shake my head in disbelief. The deal's done. I think within a week or so, the sanctions are lifted. That massive infusion of capital is going to head to Tehran. And you can only expect more, not less, of the violence and the recrimination and terrorism. There's suddenly another funding source, a rather substantial one. Oh, by the way, in case you haven't noticed, since the time that they agreed upon arrangement was vetted here, and we're unfortunately unable to block it, I think the Iranians have launched a couple of missiles capable of delivering at a rather substantial distance a nuclear warhead. I think it was in violation already. They weren't supposed to have access to the kind of capability, but even before that, they made acquisition and purchased some anti-aircraft weapons from Russia, which also was in violation of the agreement. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But that's the reality. You're going to have to deal with it. I'm not going to second guess how we're dealing with it. But I also don't think when I look at that part of the world, and I'm going to say this, ladies and gentlemen, that we ought to simply look to Israel to try to address or redress what I consider to be a global problem. One of these days, the West, instead of talking about the refugee crisis, will accept the reality that the West, including the United States, is in large measure responsible for that refugee crisis. And for the past couple months, everybody's been focusing on the consequences of passivity, the consequences of inaction, the consequences of looking the other way, the consequences of saying Assad must go, he's still there, the consequences of saying there's a red line in the sand, if you broach it, there'll be consequences, no consequences there, the consequences of letting Russia invade another country and no consequences. I don't have to tell you about Iran. Iran's been killing American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan for a long time. No consequences. So this pot continues to boil, and I think the Western leaders have to take a look at themselves and say, a decision not to act is a decision. Indifference is a decision. Failure to respond to that threat, to the genocide, 300,000 Syrians killed at the hands of Assad, with the support of Russia and Iran. I don't know, they used to tell me that an ostrich will bury its head in the sand from time to time. Well, maybe that's the defense mechanism that the United States and the West has taken, but it is clearly not in the best interest, their sovereign best interest, but the broader interest of global peace and stability. This is not a threat that can be contained, and I mean Iran, and the radical Islam is not a threat that can be contained. It has to be exterminated, eliminated. And until we have, as Senator Lieberman pointed out, until there is much more aggressive behavior led by the United States or some Western country, because I don't think we're going to lead it. By the way, I must tell you that there's a lot of talk about the sorties that we're flying. We're flying 15 or 20 missions a day. You know, during the first Gulf War, we flew over 1,000 a day. If we're serious about military engagement, this is a puff piece. This is an illusion that we're trying to carry on, and it's making maybe people comfortable in Western capitals, certainly might be comfortable people around here, and nobody has said we need to send 100,000 troops to deal with it. But somebody in the Western world has to step up and lead a coalition of Western countries, including the United States and NATO, and some of the countries in the neighborhood. It is their neighborhood, the Arab world. Do yourself a favor and just kind of Google the military capabilities of some of those countries in the neighborhood. You're going to see they got 1 million people in uniform, they got thousands of tanks, thousands of airplanes. They ought to be participating in this in a much more meaningful way. And by the way, it'd be nice if they took some of the refugees as well, but right now they're hands off, and yet it's your neighborhood. Now, one of these days, an inspired, courageous Western leader, doesn't have to commit there, it has to be a multinational effort, is going to deal with this threat. But until they do, those of us who admire the Iranian resistance, we have to stay focused on how we best can help them, because we're not in a position to change American foreign policy as indifferent and as feckless as it seems to be vis-a-vis that part of the world. We see what happens when there's a total absence of leadership, don't we? Nature abhors a vacuum. Think about this for a moment, and I'll move on to something relevant specifically to the people at liberty, but think about this for the moment. If you believe as I do that nature abhors a vacuum, so does politics. So who is at the epicenter of the negotiations to try to bring peace and some stability in the Ukraine, even though there have been 2 ceasefires have been violated? Russia. They were the catalyst. They precipitated the crisis. People are still forgetting about those couple hundred innocent civilians that got blown out of the air. People have forgotten about that, let alone the invasion of a sovereign country. And ironically, Putin has volunteered to help bring some stability to the region. Rather remarkable gamesmanship if you think about it, but then take a look at Syria. Who's been providing additional support in addition to Iran? It is Russia. And they want to intervene and bring stability to that region, and part of their stability is keeping the man in power who has been responsible for the death of 300,000 of his own citizens. And I swear one of these days we're going to find out, because they are radical Sunnis, we're going to find out that there was an Iranian conspiracy supporting that, because it was their best interest to keep them not only creating problems in Syria and Iraq, but also continue to let them spread this medieval barbaric scourge within the region around the world. So while somebody tries to fill that vacuum, we have to stay focused on the defenseless people at Camp Liberty. I don't know how many men and women we have from the Senate staff here. I want to first of all thank the sponsors, your continued and sustained advocacy and support coming to these events on the Hill, and I want to thank the men and women from the Senate offices for taking the time to join us. Because when America made a promise in 2004 to protect and defend these people, it wasn't a Republican promise, it wasn't a Democrat promise. We had a general hand these individuals a piece of paper and say, you have our word, you've surrendered your weapons, you have promised to provide you security and safety. We haven't kept that promise for 10 years. And I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat, the coin of the realm in the world of politics, in your personal world and in our world and on this Hill, is your word. And if you can't keep your word, how do you keep your friends? How can you be trusted? Well, fortunately for those of us on the stage and many, many others, there are still some Americans, Republicans and Democrats, that the Iranian resistance trusts. And we're very grateful to be included among those. And those who are trusted advocates and friends, these men and women are here to say to the Senate, help ensure that we keep our promises to these people. 10 years later, I will just flat tell you that the State Department and the United Nations lied repeatedly to Republicans and Democrats, military leaders, diplomatic leaders, and political leaders and law enforcement leaders throughout the entire time we were moving these people from Ashraf to Liberty. Just flat out made very specific statements. Said we will do A, B, C, and we're still waiting for any of those to be done. So we cannot repair that, but as we look ahead to the future, there's still some things we think can be done in the short term, and hopefully we'll expedite the repatriation, which we were promised years ago would be expedited, but it hasn't. Thank God we've got a few friends around the world. Albania has been really generous and supportive of this, but we're looking for other countries, in fact, I'd add, even including the United States, to step up. But even before that can happen, there are a couple of things that need to be done. And I want to echo Senator Lieberman's call to the Congress of the United States, where we've both been product of the legislative process. I'm not looking for language in a committee report. I want a directive, maybe with some money tied to it, to the State Department and to DOD to say, you expand that air cover from Baghdad Airport, it's just a couple clicks away, to Camp Liberty. Just expand it. That would be a signal to the Iraqi government, which is still under the thumb of Tehran, but more importantly to Rouhani and the mullahs. We're serious about, at this time, we are finally serious about keeping our promise, in spite of the fact that during the time we were supposed to keep our promise, we've had 140 murdered and hundreds killed. And so we come up to the Hill, we come up and talk to the Senate, to those of you who are kind enough to join us, for a couple reasons. One, continue to advocate. We continue to try to educate what this is all about. That's a good enough reason. We're up here to educate, to plead, to convince you that these 2,200 remaining people are worthy of this air cover, this air umbrella to secure them. We're up here to remind you it's a credibility issue. We gave our word. We haven't kept it. It's about time we did. We're up here to remind you this is also a humanitarian issue. These people were promised by the UN High Commissioner on Refugees we'd take care of them. We send a lot of taxpayer dollars to the United Nations. Frankly, from time to time, I think it's outlived its usefulness. They really haven't had much geopolitical impact. Occasionally around refugees, they do some pretty good work. But they lied to these people. They lied to Americans, who they asked to help them move people from Ashraf to liberty. So we're going to educate you about that. It's their credibility that is eroded. Actually, it's non-existent in my mind. There's a humanitarian cause. You people live, I think our friend Mayor Giuliani said it quite some time ago, it bears repeating. We moved them from a place with at least a liberal, habitable environment almost into a concentration camp. They had to rebuild the entire infrastructure so they have basically decent shelter. And we continue to fight to give them defensible shelter, all in contradiction to the promises that were made to us years ago when we said they'd move. So we're trying to educate, convince you. It's a credibility issue, it's a humanitarian issue, but then now I want to go back to that image that we saw, and I asked you to almost close your eyes. You're in a combat zone. You don't have any weapons. You can't go in and out of this area. You're a target. You're an immobile target. Oh, and by the way, some of the projectiles, some of the rockets were made in Iran. Let's not forget that. I got the answer. Hope you figured it out. I think you probably figured it out a long time ago. Why are they subject to constant attack, constant intimidation, constant threat, constant pressure, slow roll by my country, the United States of America, being ignored by the United Nations? Is there the most significant, legitimate, organized opposition to the mullahs and Rouhani? And as long as they exist, and as long as they talk about a free, tolerant, diverse Iran, as long as they talk about a non-nuclear Iran, really perhaps a nuclear Iran for peaceful uses, but not an armed nuclear state, as long as they exist, as long as they project that profile, as long as they are doing what they have done for over a decade, is celebrate the richness of the culture and the history of Persia and the Iranian people, but say, this is not who we are. This is not what we stand for. As long as they survive and protest the medieval treatment of fellow Iranian citizens inside Iran today, eye gouging, amputation, public hangings, imprisonment. As long as they are led by Madame Rajavi and continue to advocate her 10-point plan, as long as all these extraordinary dimensions and characteristics of this resolute, relentless resistance, they will be a threat. And it's about time we accepted our responsibility not only to keep our word, but protect people who try to project for the benefit of their own country, not themselves, the opportunity to live the kind of life that most people dream about. Extraordinary country, magnificent culture, great history, educated population. But until the Ayatollah and Rouhani is in charge, then the people with that, particularly the young people, are never going to reach their potential. So it's our job to continue to advocate you to try to make a difference in their lives. The numbers are dwindling. They're dwindling because many have been murdered. Some are just dying of natural causes. Several have died because they couldn't get adequate medical care, because they're restricted as to when and if they can leave the compound. So we kind of get to the into the new year and everybody makes resolutions. I think it's about time we kept a resolution we made 10 years ago to these good people. We'll provide for your safety and security, and we'll expedite your repatriation to a peaceful place where you can raise your families, potentially return to Iran under different leadership. But before they can do that, we have to secure their presence. And I think one of the most important signals we can send to Tehran is build that air cover. Let's build that air cover. And let's do it with Republican and Democrat support. Thank you very much.